What is up, everyone? Welcome back to Your One Podcast. We're at episode 15. So we've come a long way. We appreciate everybody on the journey. We're continuing it and loving every bit of it. But I'm joined by the insightful trio of Zachary Crilly, Micah McNeil, and Felipe Segura today. And I know last week we talked a little bit about geopolitical context and kind of the election, what that meant. But today we want to dive a little deeper into the implications of deglobalization. It's a mouthful, but like we hear about China, we hear about the tensions rising, and we kind of like, I don't know if you guys feel this, but I feel that in this election and all of the media around it, there's a sense of nationalism to each candidate. And I was wondering like what you guys think of that. What are some of the other examples of it and what it kind of means?
Yeah, I could start. I think there's like a very telling example of what you were saying, Gavin, where when the UAW did their strike for all the car manufacturers, right? The UAW is endorsing Biden and whatnot. Biden went and walked the fence, the picket line or whatever with all the people on strike. And Trump also went and gave a speech to a bunch of UAW worker people on strike and was supporting them. So there is that kind of feeling of very pro union, pro working class interests in like the Midwest, which primarily means better trade deals on behalf of the US and more protectionism, right? Because frankly, I think it's too expensive a lot of times to build something here when you can just build it in China. One of the business ventures I'm in, I've personally talked to Gavin and Zach about this, but I mean the price difference is kind of striking. So yeah, in certain areas, it's really not competitive unless there is like an incentive on behalf of government, and I think both sides are leaning into that.
And to back it up a little bit, I have a helpful chart that I will share that shows the trend of globalization throughout history, um, brought to you by our friends at the World Economic Forum. And here you'll see how really globalization was in hyper effect from 1990 until really about 2016 was when it started to cool off. And then obviously the COVID pandemic accelerated that. And this is the big picture perspective. And then here we kind of have a more micro looking from 2021 into the end of 2022, and we can just see a trail off of growth in imports and exports. And what are examples of that? I, I, Felipe, you mentioned China. In my opinion, that's the figurehead of this deglobalization effort. Um, it seems like there was a slow waking up to the fact that the US economy and the Chinese economy had become increasingly and incredibly interdependent. And that has become a real threat for um, not only in the hypothetical, oh, the supply chains, but in the practical, which was exposed during COVID of, okay, wait a second here. If if these guys either don't want to or cannot send us things that we need, we might fall apart. And that's something that is unpalatable to um, a lot of people. So I think China is really the head of this whole deglobalization effort, not so much as that they're driving it, but in the fact that they're almost have become, in a way, like the uh, the thing that the U.S. is trying to move away from, and we see that most poignantly, I would say, in the CHIPS Act that was carried out under the Biden administration, where they said, "Hey, we're not going to send any high tech, super, or what are these things called? superconductors,
Semiconductors.
semiconductors to China anymore. In fact, if you hold a US passport, you cannot work for a Chinese semiconductor firm. So that's a pretty dramatic step. And I think a really poignant example of um, this trend of deglobalization that we're seeing and we're feeling becoming more and more solidified and palatable as time continues.
I do feel like if we kind of move away from China, which is the trend right now, we'll replace that with something else. And I feel like there's many countries that are able and willing to take that manufacturing on, like India, for example. Like, do you guys think that would kind of replace some of the manufacturing and we could just kind of move things over there and keep the costs down, or would we have to take things back to the US?
Well, I think that's the goal of things such as the Chips and Science Act is to bring that manufacturing back home, right? I was looking at a chart. I'll actually share this. This is related to the semiconductor business. Hold on. Can you see that? Can you guys see that? So I was just looking at this, right? And this says that 70% of total manufacturing currently lies in South Korea, Taiwan, and China, right? And then this is the manufacturing of those chips, right? And basically what I gathered from this is that it's basically 70% of it's held between three countries, that being China, South Korea, and Taiwan. And what does this mean for the United States? And why did we sort of put so much money into so much investment into bringing some of that manufacturing back? And it's important. I think one of the lagging indicators for why we're doing this is because we're seeing this such this vast increase in sort of inequality as it relates to sort of our values or some of the monetary output that we get back. And I think that's relatively the focus for why we're seeing this such influx of nationalism, and why it's really important for the US to sort of steer the way in bringing back sort of middle America and the middle class.
Well, but so in that, what that chart doesn't say is that's total semiconductors, but the big issue is high-end semiconductors, the ones that are critical to the military, to like everything that's super advanced, that if God forbid we go to war or a major conflict, the ones that like make the difference, 90% are in Taiwan.
Right, but they produce it, right? They have a
Yeah,
specific skill in it. We don't. So just by putting money into something, and saying that we're going to put money into it doesn't really do anything unless you have that specific skill set that the Taiwanese have, right?
it's even worse than what you were saying, is that 90% of the really important ones
Yeah.
are made somewhere that's like potentially could be invaded. Yeah.
Mhm.
Which is a brilliant play by them to become critically important to the United States national security by producing this product. It's pretty unique.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean that's like where Vivek was basically saying, like, we just need to promise them protection until we can produce our own semiconductors and then leave. I think
Mm.
that was I mean, say what you will, what would the Chinese react to that? I don't know, but that kind of makes sense in some ways, right?
And Gavin, to bring it back to your question, in terms of okay, so shift away from China, do we just find for a new cheap labor source is really what it is, right? To produce stuff. And I think that there's a couple different things there. One, it depends on the product, like we talked about. Keep on wanting to call them superconductors. Semiconductors are a great example of something that's like super high end. I don't know if like cheap, tacky knickknack products. I don't know if that's really a priority to onshore those. But I think a huge underlying effect of why we're seeing this deglobalization and really the rise in nationalism that is, I think, sparking it and accelerating that trend is the fact that a lot of the manufacturing jobs have been hollowed out of middle America. And you have this concept of like the Rust Belt and the Appalachia um, and surrounding areas. And those people are upset because they feel like they had generations where families worked in factories that produced widgets or goods, and then those factories shut down and they moved abroad. And they feel like they got the short end of the stick. And they politically, they need to be placated somehow. So I don't think that the solution there is just, I don't think that they'd be thrilled if it's like, hey, great news, your jobs aren't in China anymore. They're in the Philippines. It's like, no, I want the jobs back here in my town. So that's a big thing to consider.
So have you guys seen the Netflix documentary that Obama helped produce, American Factory? It
Is
was
that
Is
about
that
the
the one that was like,
yeah, it was
yeah,
about the Chinese guy. Have you seen it?
No.
So I mean, it's really interesting because like basically it's the Chinese guy builds a factory in America, and at the end, through all like the unions and everything, he basically decided like, okay, I'm just going to replace all the human labor with machines, and that was like the only way to, I guess, make it financially plausibly successful or whatnot. So that is a good question. Like everyone's talking about this is going to save blue collar America, but when you look at like factories like Tesla, they're trying to automate a ton of the processes to make it as cost effective as possible. So there is a question of does it even make you competitive if you're just producing everything in country the old way of doing things, right?
And that brings up a great question too, which is the free market question, right? And I think all of us are in agreement that we're good, free market loving capitalists. But I think that we would also be in agreement that there's certain areas where it's worth um, maybe manipulating the marketplace a little bit in order to protect, um, dare I say, national security, even though that can be a slippery slope. What do you guys, how do you make of that in terms of pairing a strong desire to make a strong America that can produce things for itself with also a belief in free markets? Can those two things be compatible, or are they inherently against each other?
That's a tough question. I don't know. I part of me says that if you automated enough processes in a factory, which like requires massive amounts of capital up front to do, then you could make it more efficient than like human labor. I had a friend that, for example, worked at Under Armour, and he was telling me that there was like one thing that they tried to automate on like the sneaker, which was like the way that the sole was put in or and like stitched in, and it didn't work, and they spent like 10-15 million dollars building this machine, and like that was a huge loss for a publicly traded company when like you get a bunch of uh low wage people in China, or I don't know where they were producing it, were able to make it at a fraction of the cost. That's like a serious risk, and I think definitely this is a question more for like larger manufacturers, but I'm interested also in like how you think of it as like an entrepreneur, with like no capital. How are you going to build a factory, or is it even make sense to build a factory, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing, like in a free market, it's usually the lowest cost good for the same quality is going to win. And it's like, okay, if you have China labor costs, China costs of good, which are very low, plus shipping, if that is less than the amount it would take to get the same quality good in America, then it's pretty hard to vouch for that product or whatever you're making to succeed in a free market. So it's like, okay, how can you bring down those costs? And it's automation, but I don't know if you guys remember in the Elon book, but he was saying how automation is a little more difficult than people think. And he was ripping out automation machines to just replace people with them. And I think that's honestly the case for a lot of goods. And you see companies popping up like Temu, who probably have 1 million factory workers just pumping out these goods for $1 each. And that has been all the craze on social media because they just keep on pumping ads. So how does a US company compete with a company like that in the free market?
Tesla produces in the United States? Is it worth giving from the public interest and from the legislative and policy position? Is it worth giving them significant tax discounts to kind of manipulate the free market so that it makes sense for them to produce domestically? Like, is that important enough to do it? And what do we care about? What are the things that we care about doing that with? Do we care about doing with that with the Timu slippers that you buy? Probably not. But about batteries and semiconductors and oil production and medical equipment, maybe. Where's that line?
Yeah, that's probably the question. And I do think it might be answered in this election. Like, how much do people and consumers care about national pride? And if that is going to be a huge point.
What do we think the reason, why is deglobalization happening now? Do you think it's mostly due to the pandemic, or was that just a catalyst that kind of exposed a trend that was already going on?
I think it's a couple of things. I definitely think that COVID was a huge one. I think in Western Europe, I think their reliance on Russian oil after Russia invaded Ukraine was a huge implication. And I think those two combined things sort of, and then also just like the natural flow of globalization, because at its core, it's, with NAFTA and then other acts, we sort of shipped off of all of these jobs. And now we're sort of on that idea of sort of trying to bring them back. I think all of those things, and then just heightened political implications have been sort of the main figures for why we're headed back, or why it feels like we're headed back towards deglobalization. But I guess time will tell.
Well, I think there's also a massive voting bloc in a few key states really care about deglobalization. I mean, what do they say? This election is going to mainly come down to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. I mean, those are three states that were absolutely destroyed by globalization. So, and people who like want their jobs back, or the old time, or their old jobs back. I mean, I went to University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. Like, it was a city that its heyday was in the 50s because it was a massive manufacturing town, and it was just completely destroyed with globalization. And you can drive by a bunch of different towns in the Midwest, Gary, and the list goes on, that are like terrible, like and destroyed because of it. So I think that's definitely something that's key. Yeah.
Do you guys think the genie is like sort of out of the bottle though? Like, I don't really understand how you massively go back towards deglobalization, right? It just seems like the production from exports to imports is just at a pace where it just doesn't seem apparent. Like, a really company is going to be okay with their growth margins just being significantly like higher, or the amount of money they're making to their bottom line being significantly lower. I wonder about those implications, and if we're okay with those numbers and our stock market performance and the S&P not being, as high as they have been for the last 40 years.
I think at some point there has to be, I agree with you, it's not just going to happen naturally. I think that there has to be an outside force that kind of makes it happen. But I come back to this chart and you look at, okay, when World War started breaking out, protectionism came into play pretty strongly. I mean, looking at this, like the trade openness, which I'm not quite sure how they're measuring it. It says exports plus imports as a percentage of GDP. Okay, great. Fell significantly from a peak of nearly 40% to a low of under 10%.
So we're going to war.
No, I'm not saying that's a great.
I mean, if you look at that chart though, right? I mean, in
But
both
but
cases,
frankly,
right?
I think we're in a soft war, not a kinetic war. But I know that from my experience of spending time in China, they certainly feel a competitive nature towards us, and
Right.
they've been leveraging again, not hard power, not boots on the ground, but
Hmm.
alternative warfare, economic warfare,
Hmm.
cultural warfare, um, and I think that
So
this
let
is
me,
becoming a more and more important thing that people will rally around. And
right.
I think that that's to kind of flip it a little bit into like what we can do. I think that this trend, like most trends, if you can get in front of it, it's great. And I know that
Hmm.
I am willing to use my dollars personally to support American businesses as opposed to supporting foreign businesses. That's something that I'm willing to do. Not in all cases, but in the cases where it makes sense, yeah, I'm willing to spend an extra $2 or $3 if that allows for the company to produce something that I care about domestically.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, though, what you just said is, and I think that answers Micah's question right there, is if you move everything to the US, inflation will go up.
Right.
Like, because it's going to be more expensive to produce everything in house. There's going to be less competition. You know, you're not competing if you're a factory with 6 billion people in the US, or if you're trying to produce in the US in a deglobalized economy, you're competing with 350 million. That's like 1/20 of the people. Um, so the only way, like as you were saying, Micah, like are these Fortune 500 companies can be okay with bringing everything back is lowering the price. And the only thing that I know of that, and historically in humankind is deflationary, is technology.
Right.
Like getting
Uh-huh.
something that like leverages one person can create double the output as opposed with technology, right? So that has to be the solution, I think. And I think what I think is really interesting actually about the deglobalization conversation is I think the last 20 years, we've mainly been focused on bits and bytes. And I think this was Peter Thiel who talked about this, where we've like focused on Instagram and the next Fortune 500 person or the next big unicorn is going to be some app that everyone's using. And we haven't really focused on like hard, like technological, physical things in front of us. Like if you go on the railroad here in the States, it's terrible. Like in Europe, everything's super fast. In Japan, crazy. But here, they just haven't invested in it. And that probably is going to be a massive sector in the future. And I think as entrepreneurs, it'd be interesting to figure out how to get in front of that. I just it's tough to think about ways to do it, but if you can, I think there's a lot of opportunity, right?
And to shift it into like, okay, off your point, like, okay, what do we do? How do we get in front of it? I don't. It's interesting because Gavin and I have gone through the process of new product development, and you run into China in the supply chain like nearly everywhere you go, right? And it's just significantly cheaper. And it was a priority for us to um, to have a domestically made product. But it's hard. It's hard to compete when that's something that is prioritized. How do we impact it in our lives now? Felipe, I know your business is globally oriented. Micah, I mean, you're in the investment world. I'm sure that there's a lot of international clients that you deal with. What do we as ambitious young men, how does this affect us, and how do we take this information and apply it to our lives?
I mean, personally, I think it's really putting our dollars where our mouth is. Like, do we want that trend to continue of taking business back to the US and, like you were saying, putting money to products that are made here and building products that are made here as well. Like, but it's the question of, okay, does that future, would you rather have a future where you could only buy American products or you could only buy imported goods? And I'd rather live in a future where you buy American products, know the quality, know that it's benefiting, where you are.
Yeah, as a consumer, that sounds beautiful. Like obviously I agree with you, but I just don't for the last 40 years we've had a sort of interlocked world where businesses can outsource their production to another third world country or an emerging country. I just don't understand how like we can even bring in immigration, but I just don't understand how we can at least bring that back in the short term, and it have like everlasting impacts for the good. But obviously if like yeah, sure, like I would love to buy everything built and made in the United States, but um that doesn't really help people's their margins and their gross amount of money that they make.
No, and
Yeah, go ahead.
to your point, like it's not only affecting now blue collar workers, it's affecting white collar workers. Like
Exactly.
how many people I've met now that say, "Oh yeah, I have the software team. We pay them way too much in like San Francisco, so hell no, am I going to pay them? I'm just going to go to Vietnam and
And
I can
hire a
get
farm.
like a software engineer for a fifth or 50% off, and I can get a bunch of them. They're just as good because it's just a language.
Mhm.
So that's another issue. Like
You can thank
it's not
COVID for that.
it's
You
not
can thank
only
COVID for
it's not
that.
only blue collar though. It's
Yeah.
white collar too.
Yeah. And it's pervasive, as you said, accounting. I was having a conversation earlier with one of my friends who's an investment banking analyst in one of the top Wall Street firms, and he says, first of all, he said he listens to podcasts, so shout out Charlie. But he says
Love you, Charlie.
that a big part of being a or an investment banking analyst used to be the PowerPoints, but he says now he sends it over to India at midnight, and by 5 a.m. it's done. And what I mean, it makes sense, right? Especially in the labor pool. And that's like, I think that's almost a separate conversation as services, goods versus services. But I'm just so curious as to what this means for us and how we can apply it, because there's definitely great and beautiful parts of globalization. I mean, we've all benefited from a globalized world, and we've all had global experiences and international friends that we love and care about. But I think we all also have a sense of duty and a love for our country, and we want to see it grow and thrive and prosper. Um, and how we make that happen, I think, is a good question to think on. And I think it goes beyond consuming. I think that we're responsible for producing solutions in this area.
Well,
Yeah.
not even if you want to be responsible. I mean, the trend is deglobalization. I mean, that trend's not only by people being like, "Oh, we need to bring jobs back." It can be also because of the government, like imposing massive tariffs that make it more cost effective to do it here. So, not even if you have a good spirit for made in America, you're going to have an incentive as a greedy capitalist to do it in America soon. So, yeah, to your point.
Mm.
I mean, here might be a kind of grim forecast, but if you, like if I'm looking at labor here in California versus China, it's just ridiculous. It's like 17 an hour for minimum wage, and then there, who knows what it is. But the only way to make that economically make sense is for that to be replaced completely by a technology. And as the US gets better and better at technology, AI replacing customer service, then replacing coders, then replacing XYZ job, I see that as where it's headed. And if we're talking about bringing production back to the US, I think that's an area where we could feasibly bring that back. Like I don't really see a world where we could do that with a person. Like there's really no economic sense to do that with a person when it's literally a fraction of the cost.
I just did a quick Google search because I just disagree with that. I think that it's not all, there's certain things that matter more than, from the consumer side, just cost, and from the business side, pure profit margin. I know that that sounds like in the greedy capitalist way a bit silly, but looking at this, this says that 48% of people are willing to pay higher amounts for buying US based products. 65% of people claim that they intentionally buy American made products. This is a priority for people. And to Felipe's point, even if you throw away all of that and you are just a ones and zeros, the greediest capitalist possible, there are a growing amount of, yes, tariffs on one side, but also stimulus on the other side, and positive incentives for businesses to produce domestically. And I think that those all adding together make it so that it's like, okay, this is a priority for people. There's government support. This is starting to make more and more sense.
Yeah, and I will say, like, it's not. I think if you're an entrepreneur and looking at like, so what can I do? I think the best place to look at is like Germany is a great example, or even Japan. These are places that people aren't getting paid, like they're not getting paid less than Americans or barely getting paid less, but they're creating really good products that sell in America. And you know, you can think of companies like Toyota or Audi, Mercedes. I think Siemens, the like the air conditioner, um, they're also German, and so I think the answer to that is just making better premium products. But at the end of the day, like if the cost is going to zero to produce things all around the world because of AI, and you have all these tools that help you integrate things, and now you can go to Fiverr and Upwork to get all these things, I think it's just really like survival of who makes the best product, whether it's a tech product or a physical product. And I think we can look at it pessimistically sometimes, but I think optimistically too. Like you can look at it and be like, it's now easier than ever to make a product as an entrepreneur than it's ever been. Like even the idea of like venture capital with no risk, like you can start a company, can fail, and you can start another company. Like I don't think that has existed in many other eras, you know?
And that's a beautiful thing. But Charlie Munger has this quote. It's like, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. I just wonder where these companies are going to go when the incentive is changed, where they don't have as much as a market as they probably normally had, right? Gavin, you brought up like coders. Like some of the business incentive might be to like put coders out of work so computers can do all of the work. So I just think in some of these industries there has to be a focus on the consumer and then also keeping industries alive. Like it would be nice if I could have a robot that could pick every strawberry that I ever wanted, but does destroying the farming market and putting 10 million people out of work, is that good for the United States? I mean, it's obviously good for the business, but is that good for the consumer base? So some of those questions are things when you bring up technology are things that we're gonna have to talk about and then maybe put some stopping grounds as it applies. But I share, Felipe, I share your sort of rational, optimistic view on some of just the ability that individuals have, and especially entrepreneurs have, with technology such as AI. And I hopefully it just has a net positive on society, and not a net negative.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, like every new product that comes out, I think like the best thing to do, and that's like something I've been trying to work on now, is just like finding people who are using that technology in a business sense and then asking
Mhm.
them, what are your problems with this product? Oh, do
Mhm.
you like it? And I mean, the answer to your question, Micah, like the libertarian argument, like if we made a machine that could pick all the strawberries and unemployed 10 million people, you could also look at that as 10 million people now have something else to do to be productive
Right.
for society, right? And like, yeah, I mean, we're at record number of unemployment, with the most people that have ever lived in the planet currently living in the planet in the most technologically advanced society. So, yeah, I mean, I think the opportunity is like looking at new technology and figuring out what are the problems, because every time there's something new happens, there's a new economy that's created off of it, right? So, yeah.
No, you're 100% right. I don't think there's a set number of finite jobs. I think technology enables you to make new jobs. I guess my point being is it could be something that happens overnight, and that's the shortfall that we have to avoid, where there has to be some sort of like adjustment period, right? When the horse and carriage business went out of business for cars, that business went around, but there was something to replace it, right? I hope with AI there's something that we could come up that replaces it, right? And that's more my worry. But I totally agree with you on the technology enables us to make new creative
Yeah. I
other
mean, on that front,
opportunities.
I just have so much confidence. Like Felipe, you just mentioned a great statistic. Oh, there's never been more people, but we have lower unemployment. I just have a fundamental confidence that everything is going to work out on the technology domain. But to bring it back to your products, Felipe, you had a really, that was really insightful to talk about quality. And the United States is not going to be able to compete on price of labor or price of manufacturing, probably, as we've all pointed out throughout the course of this conversation, but we can compete on quality. And look, when somebody goes to buy a car, yeah, they want the Mercedes Benz. Why? Because it's higher quality, not because it's the cheapest option,
And they
right?
now make them in the US sometimes because it's
Amazing.
cheaper than
Yeah,
to send it over
amazing.
from Germany. So yeah.
And I think and this is the domain that I'm working in now is products. And I think that that's a real learning lesson is, okay, don't focus on making the cheapest possible product. Focus
Mhm.
on making the best possible product. And people will come. And if it's made in America, even better.
Yeah. And one thing I do want to say is like this kind of skill of learning skills is going to be important. Like from the entrepreneurial perspective, a skill is just acquiring different people in specialized roles and putting them together to build a company. And now that's so much easier than ever before. And if you can go on Upwork and if you can, message all of these people to create a great company, then that is going to be a huge opportunity for you. And maybe that's what these people getting fired or getting laid off from jobs are going to do. And hopefully they learn that is okay, I no longer have this job available, but now it's easier than ever to put all of these pieces together to form a great business. And I think that is what is going to happen and what is becoming easier.
Amen.
But with that, that brings us to a close of episode 15 of Year One Podcast. Again, thanks for listening, and we wish you a great night.